live in a broken system, but I don't really like to call it broken because that would imply that it was whole in the first place, but our electoral system hasn't changed since its inception. This chart here shows how every eligible American voted in 2020. It may seem a little weird, obviously there are 3 sections when there were obviously 2 popular candidates, but we'll talk about that. Obviously Joe Biden won the election, has that large dark blue section with 31.6% of the vote. Donald Trump controls the teal section with 28.9% of the vote. 2 of the most popular third-party candidates, Joe Jorgensen and Howie Hawkins, take less than 1% of the vote. And 38.6% of people did not vote in 2020. The highest voter turnout in 60 years. And every election since then, didn't vote has been the most popular voted topic in America. And I believe this is indicative of a system that does not completely represent those that participate in it. One of the biggest flaws of our system is the way electoral power is awarded. During election nights, larger states typically getting a lot of attention because of their large amount of electoral votes. But in reality, smaller states have a lot more power. In fact, in 1 year, this room will represent the total voting power of 65.5 Californians. Wyoming, the smallest state in the entirety of the US by population, has almost more than 3 times the voting power of someone who lives a 2-hour flight away. To illustrate this flaw, I decided to find out exactly how many people could decide an election. So I took the population of the bottom 41 states, added them together, multiplied that by 72%, which is the number of eligible Americans able to vote in America, and multiplied that number by 67%, the voter turnout, or the number of Americans who actually voted. I then divided that number by 2, assuming that a politician would have to win half of the votes in each state to succeed, although they could win a slightly smaller number. And I came to my conclusion. I had spent an hour and a half of work for one number, about 30 seconds of talking material, and a headache, which is the recurring theme across this entire project. The exact number of people that could decide an election is 37.5 million out of 333, or just 11.3% of the population. No matter how small this actual percentage is of occurring, I believe the system that allows this to happen is not a system that can call itself representative. Obviously, this isn't as big of a flaw as I present it to be, but it's more to illustrate a point. We could have elections where 35% of the population decides an election, 40, 45, where a majority of people are not represented by the candidate that leads us all. Another of the most despicable flaws of our electoral system is the absolute absurd power that swing states have, or states that are so close in contention between Republicans and Democrats that literally 1,000 votes could decide who wins an entire election. Hypothetically speaking, there's no real way to prove that or give you an exact number, but the possibility is there. Let's be real. In North Dakota, your vote really doesn't matter. In the next election, North Dakota's 3 electoral votes will go to the Republican candidate. It does not really matter how you vote. The same goes proportionately for California, Texas, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey. All states with massive electoral power, but with no voter power. People can't decide where those electoral votes go. In contrast, swing states garner hundreds of political visits a year, in addition to $1 million in campaign spendings. If you don't live in a swing state, your vote really doesn't matter. When criticizing our own system, I believe looking to other electoral systems can be extremely helpful in really functioning electoral reform. So I want to look at France, who has one of the most unique electoral systems in the entire world. According to France 24, one of the most popular and influential news sources in the entirety of France, a typical election year in France deals with 2 election days. The second occurring 2 weeks after the first, in which the 2 most popular candidates compete. But in the first election day, an unlimited number of candidates compete. The only requirements other than not being a criminal and being able to vote, being you have to secure the support in the signature form of 500 elected officials across France. That's not the only unique thing about this system, however. What's also unique is the restrictions on it, especially the media restrictions, in which the media has to spend equal time covering each number of candidates in the first election day. They cannot relegate unfavorable candidates to midnight. That is also regulated. In addition, they have strict campaign spending limits, in which campaigns have to submit their books before elections or face criminal charges. During the first election day, when the voting concludes, if no candidate has a majority of over 50% of the vote, then the second election day is held, in which the top two popular candidates from the first election compete. In that election, a majority wins again. This system seems fairly nice, but it has some fatal flaws. For one, the unlimited number of candidates in the first system can lead to a really fairly unpopular candidate that secures a strong voter base to get into the second election, eking out fairly popular candidates who can lose by tenths, if not hundredths of a percent of the popular vote. Another flaw is the voter turnout in the second day drastically plummets as many French just decide not to vote for somebody they don't support. Another system I'd like to look at is Sri Lanka. According to Sri Lanka, a country study filed in the Library of Congress, Sri Lanka has a form of instant runoff voting in which voters rank their top 3 choices for a candidate. I'm not going to explain this in detail because I'll explain it later, but basically they have a way of redistributing votes to ensure that a candidate has a majority of support across the population. One of the biggest flaws of the system, however, is limiting 3 votes. If a voter does not put a popular candidate as their third choice, they run the risk of their entire vote being completely thrown out. Now, I'd like to take a look at the controversial 2016 election for a minute. I'm sure you all know how that turned out. Donald Trump lost the popular vote, but won the Electoral College, thus securing him the presidency. You may think you know how an election like that would have turned out in a system I designed, but you may be wrong. Let's look at some numbers for a second. Hillary Clinton won 66 million votes. Donald Trump won 63 million votes. But I don't really care about the numbers. I care more about the support of the American people. So let's flip the percentages. Hillary Clinton won 48.2% of the vote. Trump won 46.1%. As you can see, neither candidate had a majority of support across America. Therefore, in my eyes, neither candidate should have won the presidency. So, how do we figure out who had a majority of support of Americans? Well, we need to turn to the top 4 third-party candidates. Gary Johnson, a Libertarian, Jill Stein, a Green Party member, Evan Mcmullen, an Independent, and Darrell Castle of the Constitution Party. For the purpose of this, I'm going to award all the votes given to one of the third-party candidates strictly based on party lines. Starting off, we have Darrell Castle, who had the least amount of electoral votes, or popular votes, with 0.15% of the vote. The Constitution Party is a religious conservative party, so his 0.15% of the vote goes to Donald Trump. Next up is Evan Mcmullen, an independent anti-Trumper former Republican. It's a little tough here because in my mind his votes could go either way, but for the sake of argument I gave them to Donald Trump. Next is Jill Stein of the Green Party. The Green Party is a fairly liberal leftist party, so her 1.0% of the vote goes to Hillary Clinton, bringing Hillary Clinton up to 49.27% of the popular vote. It all comes down to the last candidate, Gary Johnson of the Libertarian Party. The Libertarian Party is a bit interesting if you don't know. They define themselves as socially liberal but fiscally conservative. So along social issues, they align themselves a lot more with Democrats, but on economic and militaristic issues, they align themselves a lot more with Republicans. So who does he go to? Who do those votes go to? In my mind, it comes down to Gary Johnson himself, a former Republican governor of New Mexico. I gave his 3.28% of the popular vote to Donald Trump, giving him 50.06%, securing him the popular vote. Now in reality, it'd be highly unlikely that an election would turn out this way, and it's almost impossible to know exactly how it would have. But this is mainly to illustrate a system called ranked choice voting that I would like to see implemented in our system. Ranked choice voting is a way to find a candidate that has a majority of support, if not a majority of votes. In this system, voters can rank all the candidates running for a position in order of preference. If, by the first counting, no candidate has a majority of first votes, the candidate with the lowest amount of first votes is eliminated and can no longer be considered for the office. Their votes, any ballot that counts them as first, now has their second choice counted as first. Their votes are then redistributed. If no candidate has a majority, this process happens again until one does arise. This system has a myriad of benefits with only a few drawbacks. For one, it gives power to the voters. They can feel like their vote is not being thrown away by voting for third-party members. It allows third parties to actually have a chance at elections and see who really supports them. It reduces the amount of mudslinging that candidates do against each other, because it's a much better strategy to appeal to a large amount of people rather than trying to secure a plurality. In the end, it gives power back to those who really deserve it, the voters. As I stated before, one of the most despicable flaws of our system are the swing states. So I propose a system that changes our winner-take-all for a state system for a percentage-based system. The percentage of people that voted Democrat and Republican would need to be acquired for each state and then applied directly to their electoral votes, eliminating electors, people who actually decide who's president, and that number needs to go to an infinite amount of decimal places to fully grant the will of the people. I decided to run the 2020 election through this system and see how it turned out. I found the percentage that each state voted from 270 Win, an electoral map website that has tracked elections since 2004, and applied those percentages to exactly the electoral votes of each state. It ended with the Joe Biden win with 273.277 electoral votes. Donald Trump held 246.282 votes, and third-party candidates held 15.401 electoral votes. As you can see, a problem could arise in the system, and ranked choice voting would need to be implemented, as if Joe Biden had not won four electoral votes, he would not have gained a majority of votes and therefore should not have been elected president. This may make our electoral system much more complicated, tedious, and ultimately longer, but I don't think that the rights of people should be subverted for the ease of an election. So, what's the point? If our electoral power is basically gone, what do we do? Well, as individuals, yeah, your power is basically gone, but I'm not the first one to have these ideas. I'm part of a movement that wants to see change in our system to give power back to the people. The most important thing you can do is educate yourself. All this information is very surface level stuff that does not cover everything. I find fairvote.org is a wonderful source for information on ranked choice voting and how to implement it and fight for it. Another important thing you can do is learn about candidates when you are voting and try to find ones that support electoral reform and in turn support them. One of the last things you can do is spread information about electoral reform and how our electoral system is flawed. Many people don't even consider that we can change our system or why we should. Even though much of the power that should be ours has been taken, we still have enough to reclaim what is rightfully ours, a truly representative system